Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Great. Thank you very much to, not the least, the EU Center of Excellence for having me today. It's actually as I told some of you on my way over here, it's my first time in Indiana altogether, so apparently I chose the right time to come, because this is the peak of the fall foliage, and it's beautiful, so I'm very happy to be here. Yes, I would like to speak about the US and the EU and the global economic crisis. You can also, I guess we could call it the world post-Pittsburgh, because I was up in Pittsburgh together with the president of my organization, the European Commission, a couple of weeks ago, and it's been a rough year, I think we can say, in the last year and a half in the world overall. It's been very interesting to be in the United States, in Washington, D.C., and also to be part of this whole new architecture that we might see emerge in the coming months and years. I'd like to divide my speech into 4 major parts. I try not to speak for too long because I prefer to have Q&A session at the end, so don't hesitate to ask me questions. You can ask me basically any question about the EU and the US and transatlantic relations, and then if I can't answer, I will be honest and say so. Right? So the first part of my speech, I'd like to just briefly mention what I think are the causes of this crisis, how we ended up in this mess. The second part is I'd like to turn to Europe and speak about what we have done in light of this crisis. Third, I would like to highlight what I think is unique about this crisis and what I think it has made happen, both in the EU and the US and in our relationship. I'd also finally just like to look ahead very briefly and see what I think we might expect in the months to come. First of all, among the key background factors that I think led to this crisis, we can probably all agree that a number of these included rapid credit growth, which was in turn linked to generally very low interest rates, both in the United States and in Europe. These low interest rates, combined with the belief that house prices will continue to rise almost indefinitely, led to borrowers taking out bigger mortgages on their houses and apartments. Of course, the fault was not only the borrowers, but also the lenders, because linked to the increase in demand for more loans was also a loosening of the credit rules that these financial institutions applied. And this eventually turned into a housing bubble, as you know, both in the United States and in several countries in Europe. Added to this was what I'd like to call the financial alchemy. Financial instruments so sophisticated that you needed a PhD to understand anything about them. I think most economists couldn't really assess the risks involved in these financial instruments. They were so sophisticated, and therefore didn't see the effects that might come when the sort of system didn't really work any longer. And once house prices started to fall, as you know, we saw a rise in mortgage defaults, which in turn led to investors losing money. And then it didn't take long before the banks and the other financial institutions started to feel the pinch, and were quickly getting into trouble. I just also think that most observers, including really good economists, were surprised at the speed at which this happened, because it went really fast. Now, early on, a lot of mistakes were done, I think, in the early weeks of the crisis, not the least in Europe, I would say, because we had a number of high-level people in Europe who almost happily said that something along the lines of, well, this is what American capitalism gone bad will bring. But of course, this will never happen in Europe. I think that was very unwise, to say the least, and it came very early, because it would not take long until we saw the sort of ripple effects in Europe. You know the saying, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? It's a very American expression. Well, that didn't work, did it? Because it didn't take long until we also were infected in Europe. And what was, I think, unique about this crisis was how fast it spread and the way it developed, because it spread both geographically and in terms of the nature of the crisis. It started as a financial crisis in the financial markets, and then very shortly, fast and quickly, turned into an economic crisis, affecting major parts of the economy overall. It spread to all continents within a few months. And what was originally something that only affected people on Wall Street and in London's, the city, soon had a very real effect on real people. And as you know, it has affected this state as well. And we've seen it in terms of unemployment, rising unemployment, both in the US and in Europe. Now, the first casualties beyond the US took place in the European banking sector. I think we all learned at least two new expressions, which this crisis, if nothing else, expanded our vocabulary in that sense. One was toxic assets. Still to this day, nobody has been able to explain what toxic assets is to me in a way that at least I understand. I think it was sort of a catch-all phrase for all things bad in terms of financial instruments. And this was, of course, linked to the sophistication or the level of sophistication of these financial instruments. So whenever there was something bad in an investment we couldn't explain, we call it toxic assets. The other expression that I think we learned was too big to fail, or TBTF, as my economic colleague call it. Now, I think too big to fail is interesting because it points to a fundamental discrimination within the financial system. Basically, the philosophy goes something along the lines of this. If you are a small or medium-sized bank or financial institution and you've made some bad investment decisions, well, tough luck. You have to bear the cost of that, and suck it up, as some would say. Because if worst comes to worst and your institution, your bank goes down, well, then so be it. Now, there's nothing fair in this, because on the other extreme, if you like, are the too big to fails. So the big banks and financial institutions. You all know that some banks and financial institutions in the US were saved. We've seen some emergency action being taken also on the European side of the Atlantic. And this makes sense from an economic point of view, because if it's too big to fail, it would, in the end, affect everybody if we let it fail or let them fail. So it makes sense. But this comes with at least two major problems. First of all, I think it's a moral problem, because how can you really, except in an strictly economic point of view, how can you defend to let small and medium-sized banks and companies go down the tubes, but not these big banks that in many cases took excessive risks? And when times were good and everything went well, the CEOs and the sort of top management of these banks and financial institutions were heavily rewarded. When it didn't go so well, then the taxpayers had to bail them out. We also had the case of Lehman Brothers, which I think a lot of people in retrospect think would have been one of these cases that was indeed too big to fail. But I think the other challenge with these too big to fail cases is, how do you draw the line, and where do you draw the line? There used to be a saying that when the United States sneezes, Europe catches a cold. And of course the meaning of that is basically that we are so interdependent and interlinked that you cannot separate one from the other if something happens. Now, a few years ago, this sort of became dated and out of fashion with the economists, and they started referring to a term called decoupling. They said that decoupling is what we have right now. Our markets are so sophisticated, and even though we're very interdependent, we can in fact make it sort of de-link the two economies and different sectors of the economies as well. Now, obviously that didn't work this time, so I think the decoupling theory has lost a lot of its validity since this crisis started. I also think that I just want to, I don't want to bore you with numbers and statistics, but I think it's important to know the level of interdependence between the United States and Europe, because most people think that these days it's all about China and India and Brazil perhaps, and their rise in the world economy, and that's certainly true that they rise fast, and they probably will be even more important in the future. But to this day, there's nothing even close to the relationship between the US and the EU. Let me just, if you bear with me, just let me give you 3 examples. European companies are the biggest investor in 45 of the 50 US states. 45 of the 50 US states. And the remaining 5 European companies are the second biggest investor. European companies make more profit in Texas, it's a big state, but European companies make more profit in Texas alone than they do in China and Japan taken together. American companies make more profit in the Netherlands, a country the size of 10, 11 million people, than they do in all of China. And to take a more local or state example closer to you, 3 years ago in 2006, European companies invested $24 billion in this state. That represents, in terms of employment numbers, about 3% of your total workforce. So, what was very stupid of some of our European leaders to sort of try to claim that this is all the US fault, it would be equally unwise to take protectionist or other measures that might hurt the European economy because we're so dependent on each other. I think that's my point. I could go on and on with these numbers, but I won't. It's just also, I think, important to remember that investment today is even more of a source of growth of the economy than trade. Trade used to be the big thing. It's still very important, but investment is also very important. Now, what happened in sort of following the outbreak of the crisis in Europe, in the United States, as I said, the banking sector in Europe was the first one to be badly hit. But of course, again, as a direct result of this, just like in the United States, soon there was a lack of credit lines and credit availability in Europe, which meant that companies went out of business as well, also in Europe. And of course, when there was no demand for products or services in the US, in the United States and elsewhere, our biggest export market, Germany, exports plummeted there. And we also had our share of the housing bubbles. We had, especially in Ireland and Spain, they were really badly affected, and they both burst as a result of this crisis, or partly as a result of this crisis. Now, if you bear with me, I'd like to turn to the second part of my speech, which is what Europe has done to try to counteract this crisis and work against this crisis. Because we're often criticized that we haven't done enough. We haven't done as much as the United States. Before I go into what we actually have done, I'd just like to point out that though there is something called the European Union with 27 member states, there is something called the Economic and Monetary Union, with 16 member states who share the same currency, the euro. We're still not one country or a federation like the United States. I think that's very important to keep in mind at the outset. We have a European Central Bank, as you probably know, which is responsible for setting the common the common monetary policy in Europe. But the fiscal policies are still decided by the member states. And this is a huge, important distinction and difference from the United States, or from Canada, or from Germany. any other federation, because even though the EU has some federal traits and characteristics, we are not a federation in the sense of taxes and fiscal policy. We have a common budget, it's true, but it's capped at 1.27% of the common GDP of all the 27 countries. So if you compare that to any other federation, most federal budgets are between 10 and 50%. So we don't have the power of money, if you like, in terms of redistributing power in Brussels or from Frankfurt. Now, concretely, what Europe has done so far in response to the crisis is the following. First of all, the European Central Bank, the ECB, has cut its interest rates to historically low levels. Yes, it's true, they've been criticized for not doing it fast enough or low enough, but I'll come back to that in a second. But they have indeed lowered their interest rates. In October last year, so about a year ago, all euro area governments, 16 at the moment, adopted a concerted action plan to support their financial systems. In December last year, so less than a year ago, all 27, all the governments of the EU, adopted something called the European Economic Recovery Plan, which is basically a coordinated fiscal stimulus consisting of 18 individual fiscal stimulus plans. So out of the 27, 18 have their own fiscal stimulus plan in effect. And this was coordinated through this EERP, European Economic Recovery Plan. Overall, this corresponds to about a 5%, an overall fiscal injection of about 5% of total GDP in the EU 27 over the course of 2009 and next year, 2010. Fourthly, we have bank rescue plans in effect in 17 countries. This corresponds to about 300 billion euros. Now the euro is about one euro is about 1.50, $1.50 in US dollars. So this corresponds to 300 billion euros in recapitalization operations. On top of that, we have about 2.5 trillion euros in loan guarantees. Now what's interesting is that the loan guarantees don't come from the EU, they come from national governments or national central banks. Last but not least, we have extra budgetary measures and something called automatic stabilizers, which bring overall support to about 3.3% of EU GDP over 2009 to 2010. I mentioned earlier that our response, not only, first of all, we were criticized for not doing anything or not doing enough, but what we have done has also been criticized, most, I think, notably by Paul Krugman, the famous Princeton economist and Nobel laureate. Krugman claims that, or has claimed, that the EU fiscal stimulus is not as big as the United States fiscal stimulus. He claims that no single country can, what he says, internalize the full benefits of stimulus. This is basically the free rider problem. Say, for example, that Germany pushes a lot of fiscal stimulus through their system, then what's in it for Austria to do something similar if there are no internal borders between the two, and if there's a lot of demand flowing over into Austria because of the fiscal stimulus in Germany. Krugman has also said that the ECB has been, the European Central Bank has been too slow to cut rates, and that the ECB has shied away from actions to unfreeze credit markets. He said a lot of things, but the last thing he has said that I'm going to mention is that economic and monetary integration in Europe has run too far ahead of the political integration, and that there is a lack of sufficiently strong institutions in Europe. Now, what can we say to our defense in Europe? Well, one member of the ECB's executive board, his name is Lorenzo Bini Smaghi, and I will refer to him as Smaghi, has responded to this criticism by saying that the fact that fiscal policy is still decided on a national level was in fact a strategic choice in the construction of the economic and monetary union. This, as we've already established, is a unique construction. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And that this can be used to our advantage in the sense that different member states of the EU and the Eurozone start at different levels. They have different problems or face different issues. Had this been decided on a central level, how do you spread this money? How do you distribute it? We would have a lot, or potentially we might have had a lot of internal debates and conflicts because of this. Now all the money is handled by, the fiscal part of the money is handled by the national governments in the respective countries. And they can do what they see would fit best with the issues they're facing. That's his first answer to some of Krugman's criticism. Now, another one is he's pointed out something that most, perhaps especially American economists, tend to miss, namely so-called automatic stabilizers. One example of an automatic stabilizer is unemployment benefits. Now, unemployment benefits in most, if not all, European countries tend to be more generous than in the United States. It tends to be in effect for a much longer period of time than the US equivalent. So this plays a bigger role in terms of the de facto fiscal stimulus in Europe. Moreover, in terms of the ECB's role, Smagi should be well placed, since he's on their executive board, to say this. He's pointed out that the ECB has in fact been aggressive in cutting its interest rates. And more importantly, Europe comes from a completely different place than the US equivalent, the US Fed. Because, as you probably know, if you know a little bit of modern European history, inflation is the big ghost in Europe, has been since in between the two world wars, when there was hyperinflation in Germany most of all, and what that contributed to in terms of the rise of Hitler and sort of the vivid memories still to this day in Germany and other countries too. So that led in turn to the ECB's mandate being somewhat different than the Fed's, the US Fed's mandate, which is the ECB only has one mandate, technically, formally, legally, which is price stability. In other words, keep inflation down. Now the Fed's mandate might have changed during the course of this crisis. I'm not an expert on the US Fed at all, but it has probably indeed expanded its powers in general, whereas the ECB has strictly kept its mandate. It's very independent from the member states and the member states' national banks, if you like. And I think this is important to keep in mind. Yes, it comes down probably to a trade-off between higher unemployment and lower inflation, but in this case the ECB has one mandate only, and that is price control, keep the inflation down. We also face structural challenges. Some of these we have in common with the United States, but some of them, I would argue, are more acute or will face us faster in Europe than in the United States. They include sluggish growth, slow growth, high unemployment. You've also experienced high employment now, but as you might or may not know, in Spain it's about twice the size of the US unemployment now. Spain just hit 19.5 or 20%, whereas I think in the US it's today around 10%. We also have high public debt, which is something you will be familiar with in the United States too now. And we have aging populations. This is true for most countries in Europe. We have seen a recent change in France. France has seen a sudden increase in its birth rates. But we think this is only temporary. We think it's not going to be near enough to deal with the challenges in the future if we don't give birth to more children in Europe. Now, third and lastly, if you bear with me, I'd just like to say a few words about what I think is unique, or has been unique, about this crisis. A little bit about Pittsburgh, and perhaps also something of what we might face looking ahead in time. I think what's unique about this crisis, in addition to how quickly it spread, both in terms of its nature and its geographical scope, is the awareness. I think for the first time, because of all these factors, leaders on both sides of the Atlantic and beyond realized that this is really serious. And I think they worked together to try to avoid a repeat of what happened in the 1930s, late 1920s, 1930s, and avoid a second depression. So they did come together. I actually witnessed firsthand in DC under the last months of your former president, George W. Bush. He called together the first G20 meeting since the start of this crisis in Washington, D.C. in November last year. We had a follow-up meeting in London this last spring. And now, more recently, we had the meeting in Pittsburgh, as you all know. I think, in terms of the legacy of this crisis, I think before we go into the G20 and looking ahead, I think we've all realized that, yes, there is a deep recession. We shouldn't sort of try to hide that fact. And yes, we will see a very fragile recovery. Perhaps it's started already, depending on where you look and what factors you look at and what sectors and what numbers. But there is a fragile recovery, but we will probably have to face for a long period of time an increasingly higher unemployment than we've seen. You already have the numbers here in the United States. They have gone up dramatically. And I think more seriously, and this is perhaps something we can discuss if we have the time during our Q&A, is how this will deteriorate public finances. But I'll leave that for now. However, it's not all gloom, because I think the big difference from the 1930s in this crisis was, again, that we haven't gone back to the sort of outright protectionism of the 1930s. We've seen protectionist measures being taken. We've seen, most notably in this country, we've seen the Buy America or Buy American provisions in a lot of legislation passed in Congress. A lot of that has been taken out, but we've seen some of that already. We've seen retaliation by Canadians or by Canada. They've passed by Chinese legislation in China. So it's not, all green either, but I think we've, thanks to the G20 and the continued dialogue between all these important economic factors and actors, I should say, we've avoided the worst excesses. Let me just give you two quotes from about the G20. First one from the Brookings Institution in DC. This was a quote the week before Pittsburgh. It goes like this: "The effectiveness of the G20 in addressing the global economy, the global economic crisis could lay the foundation for a new global order." End quote. Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia, he said a week after the Pittsburgh summit the following: "The G20 is an experiment. On its makeshift scaffolding, the success of the planet now rests." So no pressure for G20, right? But I think what we've seen is, first of all, a positive assessment that it does work. We have staved off the worst of the crisis. There is still disagreement between the sort of policy experts in terms of the economy about exit strategy. Should we exit now? Should we exit later? How should we exit? How fast or how slow should we exit? But I think the major outcome of this whole process in the crisis is that the G20 has now taken over the leadership role of whatever might come out of this eventually, in terms of a new financial supervision or new financial system, especially from the G7 and the G8. I think this is significant because this shows that the leaders of Europe and the United States have taken the emerging economies seriously. They've taken their concerns and criticism seriously. Because if you think about it, I'd just like to give you a few numbers just to sort of put you in the right perspective, or what I think is the right perspective, namely, Europe has 500 million citizens right now. The EU, 27 we have 500 million, half a billion citizens. Why is this important? Well, it's not in itself, but if you add to that, the US has what, 309 something million citizens. So together we are 800 plus million people out of 6 point something billion in the world. Now, if you let me, so I had this conversation with a former Financial Times correspondent that was dispatched to Brussels in 1979. It sounds like a terribly long time ago to most of you, but it's just 30 years ago. And when he came to Brussels to be the correspondent for the Financial Times, Western Europe alone, so this was way before we were anything like what we are today in terms of numbers and countries being part of the EU. The EU at the time had 9 member states instead of 27. At the time, the EU's population, or the equivalent of the EU's population, Western Europe alone, was 15% of the world's population, 1/5. Now we've expanded to become 500 million. We did give birth to a few kids in the meantime, and still we're down to 7.5% of the world's population. We've gone from 15 in 79 to 7.5 today. Together with the US, we are about 10.5 or 11% of the world's population. Why, again, is this important? Well, it's important because we still have 60% of the world's wealth. 60% of the world's GDP every year, the total value of services and products that are, made in this world come from the EU and the US. We are 10.5% of the population. We make 60% worth of goods and services. Together, the EU and the US trade represents 40% of overall trade in the world. So of course you will have other countries, of course you will have other actors in the world that claim their sort of existence and to be part of the decisions that are taken in the world, even if we have the impressive numbers in terms of trade and international economic growth and GDP output per year. If we only represent 1/10 of the total, of course they will have to have a greater say. And that's why we've also seen, since Pittsburgh, we've seen some movement in the distribution. I won't go into the technical details, but the distribution of power or votes in the institution, two major institutions, namely the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. But we haven't really come to a solution to overhaul or shift the power structure dramatically, but we've started anyways. I've talked for a long time already, so I think I'll just wrap up and rather focus on your questions and try to answer them. Finally, let me just say before I do so, there are a number of open questions still after Pittsburgh and for the next G20. Is the financial system healthy enough to support recovery? We've seen some positive signs, but still have some serious concerns. How do we regulate in a tougher and most of all more effective way financial institutions in general? We've heard a lot of talk about capping what CEOs can receive. Of course, there's a reason for that, because it's linked to what I said earlier, namely, if you have the too big to fail and you allow taxpayers to bail these companies out when they go down the drain, but you don't put a cap on them in good times, then there's no balance in such a system. But perhaps the biggest question of all is, how do we address challenges of globalization? Because this is ultimately what it's about, right? It's about globalization when we only deal with national policies. Because we all, even the EU with 500 million people, in the United States, the greatest country of all, with only 300 million people, how can we make decisions that will have an impact on the rest of the world? But if I had the answer to that, I'd probably not be standing here. But thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop there and take any questions you might have.
Yes. Question here. To what extent do you think that there'll be pressure monetary authority. To my mind, that's a very sharp disjuncture. The fiscal policy in some states and monetary policy is not. And will this crisis pressure that anymore, or do you think things are handling that policymakers are handling that very well without the need to reform centralization of fiscal policy, other than this coordination effort? And on that, on top of that, I'm curious about how this fiscal stimulus will be readjusted once we see if there is faster growth in some countries than in others after committing to this coordinated fiscal policy.
Great, thank you. I don't know if you heard those two questions, so I'll try to repeat the first one first, and then so the question is, if you let me rephrase it, whether this crisis and has increased pressure for a more common fiscal policy, given that we have a common monetary policy. If you allow me just one step back, this is the third attempt. Now as you know, we have an economic and monetary union in Europe, but this is the third attempt at least to create one. And back in the previous two attempts, in 69 and 77, 78, whatever it was, the plan was always to have these on an equal footing. So we would have a common fiscal policy and a common monetary policy. Well, there is a built-in problem with that, or challenge. It's obviously the principle that comes from this country, namely no taxation without representation. So had you gone down that route, you would have to move some decision-making power to, say, the European Parliament, also on taxation, to basically centralize or federalize those decisions. Now, that was deemed too sensitive to do, so in the final plan of the economic and monetary union we have today, this was the solution that they proposed, and perhaps that was more realistic because that's what made it happen, or partly, at least one of the factors that made it happen. So we have this decentralized fiscal policy handled by the national governments, then we have the central monetary policy handled by the European Central Bank. Whether this will actually have this is a very good question, because one of my professors in university, his sort of main thesis is that wait until we get a major economic crisis, then the fiscal policy, the fiscal union as he called it, will rise. The fiscal union will sort of be a natural consequence of this crisis. But obviously, if that were to happen, we would also have to have representation on the European level, which is a de facto creation of a European state. I mean, you could argue however you like, but de facto, from a political science point of view, that would be the logical step. I don't think that will happen anytime soon, but having said that, we've seen a lot of internal debates and struggles and mud wrestling almost, in between. I think The Economist had a cover where they said, the new Iron Curtain between the Western and Eastern Europe, because of most of these countries that were extremely badly hit by the crisis were in the eastern part of Europe, central and eastern part of Europe, and they had not yet joined the Eurozone, so they don't have the euro, and the euro worked as a safe haven to some extent for most of these countries during the crisis. Since the countries most badly affected in the central and eastern parts of Europe did not have the euro, their national currencies tended to tank even more vis-a-vis the euro and the US dollar, for example. So that has created some pressure, but rather than pressure, I think, to create a common fiscal policy, that has created a pressure on the national governments to actually get their house in order, to get their fiscal balance sheets in order, so that they can one day join the EMU, because that's what it's about. If you know, basically the EMU is sort of a second phase of EU membership, if you like. So once you're a member of the EU, when you qualify, you don't have too much public debt, your inflation is not too high or too fast, and you don't have too much of a budget deficit, then you can actually join the economic and monetary union and adopt the euro as your currency. If we start loosening those rules, then I think we're in a very bad place. But of course, we still have the free rider problems, and we also have the issue of it's sort of ironic, but because of this stability and growth and stability pact, which basically says that forbids any country from bailing out any other country, we could not give loans or cheap money to the countries within the Eurozone that had the euro, but we could give it to countries outside both of the Eurozone and the EU. So we helped Iceland, we helped other countries, but we couldn't help our own Eurozone members, because that would add to the free rider problem or challenge. Because if you have this rule that there is no bailout, you cannot bail out any country ever. If you do it once, then you could say, okay, you did it for them, why don't you do it for us? You do it twice, then you no longer have a pact. So I don't see it happening anytime soon, but of course there will be strains, and we've already seen for years now how bigger member states especially have actually not respected the Growth and Stability Pact rules and gotten away with it because they said, well, we have to look at it over a longer period of time, and if the economic situation in general in Europe is not good, then that will have an impact. But when times get good again, we can actually make up on these and save more. So I don't know if that answered your question. You had a second question as
well. I
well.
was just curious about the coordinated fiscal stimulus. Will that be readjusted once it finds out how much certain countries are performing faster or slower?
It's already happening actually to some extent. So I think it's sort of a constant monitoring of the situation, and they try to adjust it. But of course it's difficult as you know, economic theory is perfect, but in the real world it's not perfect because you have all these lag effects. So unemployment tends to lag, just like retail sales tend to lag. So you start seeing, you think, either positive or really bad signs in these sectors. But then when you look at other real economic data, then that might not correspond. So that's also why we have these discussions about, okay, what kind of recession is it? Is it U-shaped or V-shaped or whatever, all these W-shaped? When do we exit? That's the question. We don't know what letter we are in, so we don't know when we exit. Yes?
Is there any anxiety within the Commission reading to the delegation about this position of the President and what it means in terms of missions, particularly with the delegation? I mean, this will be foreign secretary now. How does that relate to the delegation?
It's a very good question. It's quite an advanced question. So if you allow me, I'm just going to say 2 words on the background to that question. The question is, are we concerned or even worried about this new president post of the EU being set up currently in the Commission and or in the delegation that I work for in DC? Yes and no. I'll try to explain why. I think first of all we need a better decision-making process in general in the EU. As you know, I don't know if all of you know this, I'm just going to say it in 2 words. Basically, we've been navel-gazing for the last 10 years. We've been trying to get out of this gridlock where we cannot make decisions fast enough and effectively enough in the EU, because the EU was created, or what today is the EU, was created as a coal and steel community in 1951, and decision-making rules are made for a community of 6 countries in 1951. Of course, the world is completely different today. We deal with everything from counter-terrorism to fight global warming. We are 27 member states. If you go around the table, everybody speaks for 2 minutes. You have the time to say your name and what country you're from and show your flag. Bang, that's an hour right there. We cannot go on doing this. We have to speed up the process. At the same time, it has to be democratic. We cannot just sort of overrule countries and citizens. They have to feel that decisions are legitimate and taken according to democratic standards. So this is the trade-off. This is what we've been trying to sort out for the last 10 years. And again, I'm summing up a 10-year debate. We had a lot of people in countries wanted a European constitution, because that's what you guys have, that's what most countries have. That makes sense. You want a constitution because you want citizens to be able to read who makes what decision, who is responsible for what decisions should be made on the European level, what should be made on the national level, and perhaps even on the local level. That's what we tried to sort out. It was the most open process in the world to create a constitution. We had representatives from civil society, from national parliaments, from local politicians. It was open to press. You could literally watch the constitution being drafted. Now this failed because 2 countries voted this down in popular referendum in 2005. So we came up again, we tried another attempt. Let's scrap the word constitution, because it wasn't a constitution in the first place, it was an international treaty. So that was a big sort of strategic mistake they made. They took out all references to country, or that could remind you of a country, flag, anthem, things like that. We kept citizenship, we kept a fundamental bill of rights or human rights. Then it went smoothly through all countries' parliamentary systems. Then it stopped. It was stopped by Ireland, because Ireland has this internal constitutional requirement that they have to put things like this to national referendum. Now, majority of Irish were afraid that the EU would impose an EU army, abortion. They would not be allowed to keep their Irish low taxes, things like that. So it had nothing to do whatsoever with the constitution in most cases. Now, we held a second referendum Friday before last, the 2nd of October. a majority where they basically had these things outlined to them, that this was not in violation of the Irish rights to all of these things. It passed. We're now finally, since 1999, for the first time we have a constitutional treaty that will take us through to this century and perhaps further. In this, there is a provision for a creation of a European president. The European president does not exist today. He or she will be appointed by all member states' governments for 2.5 years. So he or she will not be elected by the European citizens, but appointed by the governments for 2.5 years, renewable one. So he or she could stay in the job for 5 years, up to 5 years. But we don't know what this person will do. We have a rough idea, but we don't know in detail what he or she will bring. We don't know who he or she will be. There's a lot of speculation out there. The last 2 years, the runner-up has been Tony Blair, according to the headlines. We will see. I'm worried that we don't know what he or she will do. That's my fear. I also think it might upset the institutional balance that has been carefully crafted for the last 50 years. And when I say institutional balance, I talk about a delicate balance between the Commission that I work for. We don't take or seek instructions from any national government. We're supposed to work for the common good of Europe, whatever that is. But we cannot take instructions from national governments. That's unique. That's the sort of supranational institution. The other part is the European Parliament, directly elected by the European citizens every 5 years. And then we have the governments are represented in the Council of Ministers. Those three institutions are the main decision-making bodies today. Now, if you add a president to this who will or might or may take instructions from national governments, who might give very clear instructions to the European Commission of what he or she thinks that the best of Europe would be. I don't know. I think this will upset the institutional balance. That's my fear. I think we need new rules. We need a new, strong, hopefully, personality to lead the direction that we need to go in the EU and beyond the EU. But I think you put your finger to a very interesting point, which is what will this do to the European Commission? Because traditionally the European Commission has been the driver of European integration and was designed to do so in the original treaties. We will also have, by the way, and this I think will affect us even more, in my office in Washington and in the other 135 countries where we have an office, which is the creation of a common foreign service for Europe. So we'll basically have a European State Department. And we're still not a federation or a country, so go figure how that makes sense. I think it does, because now we have basically me and my 27 colleagues from the member states. We go to the same meetings, we go back to our respective embassies, we write a report which is to 99.9% the same content, and then we send it to our capitals. If that's not a waste of taxpayers' money, then I don't know what is. Did you have another question?
Yeah, I was just curious, is there any discussion about sort of changing the reporting lines, so to speak, of the delegation, not just in the United States, but everywhere, so just what's going on?
Yes, we will. Now we're formally, technically, legally, we are under the European Commission. We only report to the European Commission. We are happy most of the time to share whatever we find out from meetings with our member states' colleagues, because we are a union, we're supposed to work together, but we don't have a formal requirement to report to any member state capital. We report to Brussels. This will change with the new setup. We will have a European External Action Service, is the technical name of this new beast, and we will report to Brussels, to the new foreign minister, who will not be referred to as the foreign minister because one country thought that was too sensitive. So he will now have the headline-grabbing name, High Representative for the Foreign Common Security Policy / Vice President of the European Commission. Try to Twitter that if you can, or tweet. So we'll see how that goes. But we will formally report to him or her, and then how he or she shares that information with the member states remains to be seen. But I think people will be very careful at first, and then hopefully I think that will sort of work itself out. But I think it will take years before we're there. And I don't think you will see the closing of any EU embassy in DC. We will still have 28 offices, though the European Commission office will, from that point in time, be called something else, perhaps the Embassy of the European Union. But this is very interesting also, I think, from an outsider's point of view. You don't have to be an EU buff like myself, but it's interesting to see because this is changing the very nature of the EU, and it will have an effect, I think, also outside of the EU. So it's very interesting to follow these developments, and it will all sort of happen gradually now from early next year, hopefully. Any other questions? Yes?
I was wondering what your thoughts were about the U.S. dollar as the kind of a benchmark currency around the world. There's been a lot of talk about kind of supplanting that and changing it, and if you could maybe speak to what what the European Central Bank's position on that is, or other economic leaders that think about that.
Sure. Thanks. That's a very good question. So the question is, the U.S. dollar has traditionally been the sort of benchmark currency or the anchor currency in the world, and it's still the case. Now the question is, how do we see the euro in this context, and what does the ECB and other institutions in Europe, how do we view this? Well, I think it's in everybody's interest to have currencies that are valued according to their real value. That means what's their relative value in real terms, rather than some made-up value. I mean, to try to be a little bit more concrete, we've seen accusations against the Chinese to have their currency being unrealistically cheap, and the dollar has had probably been overvalued traditionally because it has held such a big portion of central banks all across the world. Now, what's interesting is, if you allow me, I came to the U.S. 3 years ago, and every time I talk to Americans in sort of outside of work, the stereotype is that everything's so old in Europe, right? And everything's so new in the U.S. Now, I always mention the euro as an example, because how old is the U.S. dollar? It's probably about 150, 200 years, right? Depending on how you count. How old is the euro? It turned 10 in January. As a virtual currency, it turned 7.5 this summer as a real currency, as bills and coins. So obviously, there are exceptions to that sort of stereotypical misconception or conception. But my point is that despite this sort of short life of the euro, it's already representing 25% of the world's currency reserves. So yes, the dollar has sort of a competitor, if you like, or another currency out there. But I think it's in everybody's interest, because we don't want to be too reliant. Nobody wants to be too reliant on one currency. I think that's not healthy. It's not good in an economic system, because once, as we've seen now in the last year, when the US market has taken a hit, also the US dollar it's been longer actually than the last year, but the US dollar has been taken some bad hits too recently. I don't think that's in anybody's interest. So what we try to do is keep currency values that reflect realities of the economy. But how you do that is very difficult. But the ECB does try to coordinate with the Fed, the Japanese central bank, and the Chinese to make sure that we don't have too big imbalances in between the major currencies. Yes.
Another question. I have a question about the political implications of the crisis, especially for elections and parties. So this is more speculative, but I mean, the European Parliament elections were a surprise because a lot of parties on the right won. The pro-capitalist parties that should be maybe cowering when this happens. And then I was in Germany, and there was no challenge to the Christian Democrats, and the Free Democrats actually increased. So more pro-capitalist parties. So what's going on? Why aren't European voters upset at capitalism and punishing parties that propose to support capitalism, especially non-incumbent parties? People just realize that the problem is bigger than their own national governments and have stopped voting this way? Or I don't get any thoughts on that.
It's a very good question. The question is, why did people vote continuously or re-elected sort of center-right governments in most European countries that have had elections in the last year, including to the European Parliament? And why weren't they more upset about this crisis and the effects of it? I don't know. I mean, I think you need to ask a comparative political scientist about this, because I don't know the individual member states. But I think overall, yes, we were surprised by the results of the European Parliament, that the centre-right group, which is the biggest now in the European Parliament, actually strengthened its relative position vis-a-vis the socialist group, which is the second biggest. My only sort of, from the top of my head, feeling would be that people tend to be wary of too expansionist policies when the economy is hit. I mean, it can go either way, but I think in some cases, if you would have big spending programs or suggestions from the other political party, I'm not sure that they would stand to gain from that.
Do you think people understand the constraints of the Growth and Stability Pact and the fiscal constraints and are want to be good Europeans in that sense in supporting these parties?
I think that's probably having too high beliefs in the European electorate. I don't think they're that sophisticated. I don't know, to be honest. I don't want to be a cynic either, but I don't think most people have ever even heard of the Stability and Growth Pact. I think what people do understand is that, or has learned over the course of the last 15 years in Europe, especially because we had a bad financial crisis in the early 90s as well in Europe, is that if you do get into an economic financial mess and you have to borrow money to get out of there, you know that you will also have to pay that money back with interest. So I think people fiscally have become more prudent in general in Europe because of that. So that would be my only explanation. But it's a good question. I don't know. I've been surprised too in some electoral results in Europe. Yes.
I wonder if you have any early insights into the signature of the Swedish presidency.
Yes. So the question is about the Swedish presidency. This is one thing that will change definitely with the new treaty. When it comes into force, hopefully next year, the end of rotating presidencies. Right now, one country of the EU is in charge of running the show for 6 months. They chair every meeting. They speak on behalf of the EU on foreign policy matters. They meet, typically, we will have a summit in 2 weeks in Washington, D.C. between the EU and the US. This is an annual summit. The president, your president, President Obama, will meet with the Prime Minister of Sweden. Now, why is that? Well, because Sweden is the current holder of the rotating EU presidency. The upside with this rotating presidency is, of course, that even small and medium-sized countries feel that they're part of this big project. But it's a huge undertaking. I'm from Sweden originally. When my country held the previous presidency in 2001, they bought bunk beds to the foreign ministry. They bought bunk beds and tin can food because they thought that we wouldn't be able to go home and sleep at night. Because it just puts a lot of strain. If you think about it, you're running the show for 27 countries. You need to be present everywhere in the world. You need to go everywhere all the time. And I don't know how many thousands of meetings any country holding the presidency has to chair in Brussels alone. And then you have the meetings in Geneva, in Rome, and wherever. So this is a huge thing. But this, if everything goes well now with this treaty and it comes into force early next year, then that will be the end of the rotating presidency. So Sweden will actually hold the last rotating presidency. And this is, again, coming back to your question from before, what will happen to my office, we don't know. We will probably be chairing all the EU meetings instead of the country holding the presidency. So we're already looking into sort of the tables and the chairs issue in our office right now, because it might come upon us already January 1st. But in terms of what the Swedish presidency has, because every presidency has a number of priorities normally, what they want to achieve during their 6 months. About 75 to 80% of the agenda is inherited from the previous presidency, because if you think about it, legislation is a long process. Basically what the presidency, the country holding the presidency does, is chairing these meetings and making sure that legislation is de facto adopted and potentially implemented as well. But this is not something you do in 6 months. This is something that is accomplished perhaps over the course of 10 years. So a lot of the agenda is inherited. A lot of the big chunk of the remaining part is what comes upon you. 9/11 obviously it turned everything upside down, not only in the United States, but in Europe, counterterrorism became the buzzword from overnight. So things like that might have a huge impact on your presidency. So basically, I would argue you have about 5 to 10% of your agenda during these 6 months that you can actually influence. And Sweden has said that they have three major concerns. One is dealing with the global economic crisis, make sure we get out of this mess as soon as possible, and in a sustainable way. The other one is to make sure that the follow-up to Kyoto, the fight against global warming, is a success in Copenhagen, December 7th through 17th. And the third one is that the enlargement of the EU continues. I don't know if you know this, we have 27 member states today. We have 3 to 4 countries waiting to become members. Croatia, Macedonia, or former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, 2 former republics of ex-Yugoslavia had this bloody civil war in the 1990s. Turkey would become the biggest member state if it were to join. And then we have, more recently, we have Iceland. Iceland is a direct effect of the economic crisis. That's another interesting aspect. Had you asked me 1.5 years ago, would Iceland ever apply to become a member of the EU, I would have said no. Now that changed because their currency tanked about 50%. They're back to square one. They only have fish as their main source of income. They thought they could be the number 2 city of London or Wall Street in Europe. It worked for a while. It didn't work the whole way. So now they're going back, and they believe, a small majority of their parliament believes that they can become members fast and join the euro, and that the euro would help them get out of this mess. So we have 4 countries in line. So Sweden also wants this enlargement to continue. All right. If there are no other questions?
Close on time as well.
Yes.
So thank you so very much. Please join
Thank you very much for coming.